Jenna Browning lifted the wooden spoon to her lips to taste the pasta sauce she'd spent the last half-hour making. It was perfect. She glanced up at the clock hanging in the brightly coloured kitchen and sighed. Talia, her roommate, should have been home by now. If she wasn't home soon, Jenna would call her. Talia had said she was meeting some friends, and she'd be home by 9, and now it was almost 10 p.m. Living in New York City was unsafe for two young women, especially at night, and Jenna and Talia always kept each other aware of where they were. She glanced around the kitchen for her phone to call Talia, and just as she spotted it laying on the end table in the living room, she heard the sound of keys in the door lock. Jenna breathed a small sigh of relief and turned her attention back to her sauce. "Jenna!" She rushed out of the kitchen at her roommate's cry, the spoon in her hands all but forgotten as she dripped sauce across the floor. "Good grief, Talia, must you be so dramatic about everything?" She cut herself off at the sight of her roommate. Talia Sanders stood in the doorway, bent over, her hands clutching her stomach as blood seeped through her fingers. "Talia!" Jenna shouted. "What happened?" She dropped the spoon and ran over to her friend, helping her onto the couch. Talia carefully stretched out on her back as Jenna pulled her hands away before lifting her shirt. 4 long slashes crossed her stomach, and blood oozed out from the deep cuts. "I was attacked," she murmured, biting her lip to keep from saying anything more. "By what?" Jenna shouted, staring in shock at Talia's exposed stomach. The slashes looked deep and like they'd be made by an animal. "Jenna, go grab some towels. I have to get this bleeding stopped." Talia pulled her shirt down and rested her hands over her wounds, grimacing in pain. Her head spinning in shock, Jenna ran down the hall and grabbed some towels out of the closet before rushing back to Talia and gently placing the towels over her stomach. Jenna looked Talia over her stomach. Jenna looked Talia over for any more injuries and noticed slashes on her neck as well. "Talia, your neck is slashed too." Talia reached a hand up to her neck and sighed. "They're not bad," she said, closing her eyes again. "What happened?" Jenna demanded again, keeping pressure on her wound. Talia opened her blue eyes and met Jenna's green ones. She sighed. "I was attacked in Central Park. We need to call the police." Jenna started before Talia grabbed her arm with surprising strength, cutting her off. "No, we cannot get the police involved," Talia shouted. She let go of Jenna's arm and started to get up. Jenna frowned as she took a step back, trying to figure out why Talia didn't want the police involved. She'd been viciously attacked, maybe even by a wild animal from the look of her wounds. Someone needed to do something. Others could get injured if the attacker wasn't stopped. Talia stood, still clutching the towel to her stomach, and turned to face her friend. "I absolutely cannot get the police involved," she reiterated, pushing her long blonde hair back behind her ear. She winced when some of it stuck to the bloody scratches on her neck. "Will you at least go to the emergency room?" Jenna pleaded as she too stood. Talia in general was pretty easygoing, but once she made up her mind about something, there was no changing it, and arguing with her was a waste of time. "No, the emergency room will lead to the police, and I just can't get them involved. I'll be fine." She pulled the towel away from her stomach, checking her wound again. "I'm going to take a quick shower. Will you help me clean my wounds after?" she asked, looking at Jenna again. Jenna nodded and sighed, watching her walk down the hall towards the bathroom. Talia had lived in the city her whole life. What on earth would have possessed her to go to Central Park this late at night? Jenna had only lived here for 6 months, and she knew better. She headed down the hall to the closet, looking for the first aid kit, while Talia disappeared into the bathroom. Jenna had come to New York City, mostly as a way to get away from her overbearing father and spread her wings. She loved her dad, but the man was a bit controlling. Her father was a general in the Marine Corps, and some days he forgot to take his uniform off when he came home. When Jenna hit 16, she already had plans for moving out, but she was smart and knew she needed to plan carefully, or she'd end up trapped back at home. Her family had taken a trip to the city when she was younger, and she had been so mesmerized by it all, she had decided that was where she wanted to live. Jenna meticulously did her research and realized she'd need quite a bit of money. New York was not a cheap place to live. It had taken her until she was 20 before she felt confident enough to move there on her own. Jenna's parents hadn't been happy with her decision, but they had still supported her. Her mother had even helped her look for a place to live. Jenna's first apartment had been a small studio and was a month-to-month lease. She'd found a job waitressing at a high-end cafe, something she'd had plenty of experience doing during her teenage years, and that was where she'd met Talia. She and Jenna had hit it off immediately and quickly became good friends. When Jenna told Talia where she lived, Talia suggested that the girls find a place together. She knew the owner of the cafe they worked at quite well, and he offered them a place in the same building. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and was much nicer than Jenna's previous place. It was also much cheaper. They'd moved in 3 months ago and turned the 2-bedroom apartment into a home. Talia, for the most part, was fun to live with. She was a year younger than Jenna's 20 years and always full of life, but Jenna knew there were things Talia didn't share, secrets she kept locked tightly away. Like why she was in Central Park at 10 o'clock at night. Jenna knew she could press her for answers. Not that she'd get any, but she really didn't want to stress Talia out. For now, she'd just take care of her the best she could. Jenna set up the first aid kit in Talia's room, along with some more cloths as a friend came in, dropping the towel she'd wrapped around her body. Talia had no problem with nudity, something Jenna had to get used to, having grown up in a house with 3 brothers. She paraded around half-naked most of the time, and Jenna honestly couldn't blame her. Talia had long blonde hair and big blue eyes. Her skin was flawless and tanned to a golden honey colour. She had a perfect athletic body and legs for miles. If Jenna had a body like hers, she'd walk around naked too. Talia pulled on a pair of shorts and a tee before laying down on her bed and pulling up her shirt. Jenna stared at her wounds, watching the nasty cuts ooze blood. "Tail, I really think you need those stitched up," Jenna tried again, as she carefully cleaned the wounds. "For the last time, Jenna, I am not going to the emergency room. Now, lay off already," she said curtly with a growl, before closing her eyes in frustration. Jenna was shocked at Talia's outburst, but focused her attention back on her task. Talia sighed. "I'm sorry. I'm just in a lot of pain. If you don't want to help me, you don't want to help me. You don't have to." Jenna shook her head as she opened up the first aid kit. "It's fine. Let me clean your wounds and get you something for the pain, and we can assess you again in the morning." Talia nodded and allowed her friend to clean and bandage her stomach before turning to her neck. To Jenna's surprise, the cuts had already scabbed over. "I think those will be okay," she said, closing the kit and pushing it over to the side. Talia didn't reply. Jenna left the room and found her roommates some painkillers and a glass of water. She looked over at the dinner she'd been preparing before Talia had burst in and grimaced as she realized it was burnt. "That'll be fun to clean up," she thought, flipping off the stove and moving the dishes to the sink. It could wait until morning. When she returned to Talia's room, she was already asleep. Jenna set the meds and water down on the nightstand before heading to her own room. She grabbed a blanket and her pillow off of her bed before going back to Talia's room and making herself as comfortable as she could on the floor. It took a bit for her to shut her mind down, but she finally drifted off. Talia had a restless night, not able to stay asleep for any real length of time. She wasn't pleased when she found Jenna sleeping in her room. "Jenna, you don't have to stay in her room." "Jenna, you don't have to stay in here," she scolded when her roommate woke to see her trying to get comfortable. "I know, but I'm worried about you," Jenna said, sitting up and leaning over the bed to check her bandages. "Fortunately, there was no blood visible. I'll be okay. I'm a quick healer," she said, and Jenna laid her head back down on her pillow before dozing back off. When the alarm went off the next morning, Talia groaned in pain. Jenna shut off the alarm and scrolled through her phone, looking for her boss's number. "I'm going to call off," she said, pressing the call button. "No!" Talia roared, grabbing Jenna's phone and ending the call. "You need to go to work," she all but shouted at her, dropping Jenna's phone before she laid back down with a grimace. Jenna stared at her friend, shocked by her outburst. Being hurt made Talia cranky. "Ta-la!" She turned her head and glared at her overly helpful roommate. "Jenna, please, I want to be alone." "Go to be alone. Go to work. I'll be fine here by myself. If I need help, I can call down to the cafe." Jenna reached up and grabbed Talia's shirt, lifting it and noticing that her bandage was seeping blood. "You're not okay. I'm not leaving you alone. What if you pass out while I'm gone or worse?" Jenna glared at her, growing frustrated. Why was she so difficult? "I'll be fine. I need you to leave so I can—" She stopped and threw a hand over her mouth, shocked at what she'd almost said. Jenna raised an eyebrow at her. "So you can do what?" "Seriously, Talia, you're pissing me off." "I'm just trying to help you." Talia sighed and closed her eyes, muttering under her breath about insufferable roommates before she turned her head to look at Jenna. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this apartment. You cannot tell anyone. Promise?" Jenna frowned as several different scenarios ran through her head. She knew Talia had secrets, but nothing could prepare her for the one she was about to lay on Jenna. She nodded. "Say it out loud, Jenna." "Tell you promise," Talia prompted, sitting up on the bed. "I promise," Jenna agreed, watching her warily. She couldn't think of anything Talia would make her keep secret that wasn't a crime. Aiding and abetting. Talia took a deep breath and let it out slowly before closing her eyes. "I'm a werewolf." "What?" Her roommate was a werewolf. Had she hit her head when she was attacked? Jenna laughed a little. "Okay." She met Talia's gaze and saw that she wasn't smiling. In fact, she looked dead serious. Talia stood up and moved over to the middle of the room and pulled her shirt over her head before slipping her shorts off. She grabbed the bandage covering her stomach and pulled it off with a grimace. Jenna frowned as she watched her friend. At least her wound had stopped bleeding. "I know, but why was she? Talia, what are you doing? Don't freak out," she said, and suddenly the sound of cracking bones filled the room as Talia shifted into a big red wolf. "Don't freak out. Don't freak out." To say Jenna was shocked would be an understatement. Her legs gave way, and she sat down hard on the bed, staring at the wolf who now stood where Talia once had. Werewolves were real. Talia was a werewolf. Had she been attacked by a werewolf and become one? Was this her big secret? Was she attacked by one last night? Jenna suddenly wasn't sure she wanted to stay in New York anymore. If the city was inhabited by killer werewolves and they were randomly attacking people in the streets. But then she realized she was in an apartment alone with a giant wolf, and fear came over her as she slowly pulled her legs up on the bed. The wolf whimpered, then sat down before laying on her side. Jenna watched the big beast curiously. She didn't seem interested in attacking, and after several moments Jenna heard the sounds of bones cracking again, and Talia sat in front of her. She eyed her friend warily. "Say something, Jenna," she whispered. Jenna snapped her mouth shut, realizing that it was hanging open. "Does that hurt?" It was the first thing that popped into her mind. Talia smirked. "No! How did you become a werewolf? Were you attacked by one? Is that why you have claw marks?" Jenna asked, trying to piece it all together in her head. "I'm so glad you're not a criminal," she muttered under her breath. Talia gave her a weird look before she stood slowly and pulled her clothes back on. Jenna's gaze flickered over her wounds, and she noticed that they already looked better. She blinked in surprise. Talia sat back down on the bed next to Jenna. "Yes, I was attacked by a werewolf," she started. "But he didn't turn me into one. I was born this way. You thought I was a criminal. Well, what was I supposed to think with you, not wanting me to share your secrets? Wait, you were born as a werewolf. Are your parents werewolves too?" Jenna felt her jaw drop open. "Yup, totally mind blown." Talia nodded and smiled, then grew serious. "But Jenna, you can never tell a living soul about werewolves, okay?" She nodded. "Who would believe her anyway? She'd sound crazy if she told anyone. This is very important. I broke werewolf law by telling you. If anyone were to ever find out, both of our lives would be forfeit," Talia said solemnly, studying her friend to make sure Jenna realized how important this was. Jenna swallowed hard. "I promise I will never tell anyone," Talia nodded. "Good, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about it when we're alone. It's actually kind of a relief that you know," she smiled. "Shifting will help me to heal faster, so how about you make us some breakfast and let me rest for a bit as my wolf? Her name is Lila." Jenna nodded slowly as she stared at her roommate, still in shock. "She won't hurt me, will she? I mean, you're not going to kill me on the full moon, are you?" Talia hugged Jenna, then gave her a small smile. "No, Lila loves you like a sister. She adores you. She would never hurt you. Besides, if we wanted to kill you, you'd be dead. We've been living together for 3 months now." "Wait, we'd be? So she's like a separate being from you?" Jenna asked curiously. "Yes and no. She can talk to me in my head, and I can feel how she feels, and she senses my feelings. We don't always agree. But she's my best friend, and I can't imagine my life without her." Talia smiled. "Now, go make us some breakfast and let me shift." 2 years later, Jenna stood in front of the full-length mirror, studying her reflection carefully. This was her last night in New York City, and Talia had convinced her to go to a club. Not just any club, but Club 𝐀𝐥𝐸, a club exclusively for werewolves. Over the last 2 years, Jenna had become proficient in all things werewolf. Once the cat was out of the bag, or rather the wolf out of the human, Talia became an open source of all things wolf. She actually seemed relieved that Jenna knew and was more than willing to answer any questions her friend could think of, and Jenna had thought of a lot of questions. She had learned that there were Quite a few werewolves living in the city, just going about their daily lives. The Big Apple Pack was located in New York and ran several very successful businesses. The cafe Jenna and Talia worked at was owned by a member of Talia's pack, which explained how Talia had gotten the apartment for so cheap. The cafe owner was good friends with her family, and more than willing to help her out. Jenna had kept her word all of this time, never once mentioning to anyone that she knew about werewolves. She knew the main person who Talia did not want her to tell was her father, though she had never said so. He was a 3-star general and had been working in Washington the last few years. Him knowing could be disastrous. But Jenna loved Talia like a sister, and she would keep her word. Jenna had protested at first about going to a werewolf club, but Talia had worn her down until she agreed. Besides the wolves she worked with, Jenna really hadn't been around any other wolves. There were 3 other servers at her job that Talia had told her were also wolves, and she knew some of their regular customers were. Talia and Jenna had developed a signal so she could point out other werewolves to Jenna, although after 2 years of people watching, Jenna had become pretty decent at picking them out herself. They were always extremely beautiful and athletic. The men were drool-worthy, and she sometimes couldn't help but stare. "You won't be the only human at the club," Talia had promised her. "Plus it's going to be our last night out on the town until who knows when. I want to make it special for you." Talia had visited the club many times and was sure it would be perfect for their last night together. She had dressed Jenna in a green, shimmery halter-top dress that matched her eyes. Jenna had said repeatedly that she wasn't comfortable in the dress, but Talia had just laughed. Besides her work uniform, she usually was a casual dresser, favouring jeans and leggings, hoodies and T-shirts. She could dress nicely if she wanted, but she tended to spend her money on living expenses. Jenna had found a pair of black stilettos in the back of her closet that brought her height up to 5'5" tall. Her long brown hair hung in waves freely down her bare back, and Talia had applied her makeup and let her borrow some jewellery to finish off the look. "You look hot," Talia said, as she hurried by Jenna and across the hall to the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. "Some sexy wolf will sweep you off your feet to dance the night away," she shouted through the closed door. Jenna sighed. Ever since she had found out about werewolves, she'd been fantasizing about that very thing. Not that she would ever confess that to Talia. The concept of mates was especially intriguing. She couldn't imagine finding a perfect soulmate who would be hers for all eternity. Like wolves, werewolves also mated for life. Jenna had asked Talia if werewolves ever had human mates. Talia said it happened, but rarely. That didn't stop Jenna from romanticizing about it, though. To find someone who would be completely devoted to you was a dream she wouldn't mind living in. She'd also fantasized about becoming a werewolf herself, though Talia had said that was impossible. Humans couldn't turn into werewolves. "Jenna, are you ready to go?" Talia's question pulled Jenna from her thoughts, and she took one last look in the mirror. "I think I am." She smoothed her dress down once more, then grabbed the small bag Talia had set to the side for her, with a few necessities. Talia walked back into her room, looking Jenna over. "You look perfect, Jenna." She sat down on the bed with her shoes. "Tonight's going to be fun, but we need to go over some rules." Jenna frowned. This was why she was so nervous about going tonight. She was curious about the place, but also very nervous. Talia had told her that most of the humans that would be in attendance would be mated to wolves. Those that weren't would have no idea they were among werewolves, which meant she had to abide by the rule. "You know rule number 1, Talia said, as she slipped on one of her shoes, fastening the strap. Jenna nodded. "The most important rule, don't tell anyone you know about werewolves. Don't even acknowledge their existence." Talia mentioned that rule pretty frequently, reminding her how serious the consequences would be if anyone learned of Jenna's knowledge. Rule number 2, if you get into trouble, or even if you feel threatened, or unsafe, just yell my name. Talia fastened her other shoe, then stood and teetered over to the full-length mirror. Most of the men at the club will be werewolves, and it's safe to say there will be more human females than males. But even if it is a human man making you feel unsafe, call for me. Rule number 3, stay away from the bourbon. Werewolf bourbon is much stronger than regular bourbon, and you will get drunk off of 1 shot. 2 shots, and date rape wouldn't be out of the question. Stick with margaritas. Jenna nodded again. That wouldn't be a problem. She hated bourbon and loved margaritas. Rule number 4, have fun. Talia hugged her friend, and Jenna laughed. She was really going to miss Talia when she left New York. Any other rules I need to be aware of? No, Talia grabbed her hand. Let's get this party started. The girls left their apartment and caught a taxi to the club. The ride was quiet, and Jenna stared out the window, watching the city lights zoom by. She sighed softly and felt Talia grab her hand, gently squeezing her fingers, before withdrawing to look at her phone. Jenna had an odd feeling that tonight was going to change her life forever. No, Jenna, tomorrow is going to be life-changing, she reminded herself. Tomorrow she would leave her life in New York City, and she highly doubted she'd ever come back to live here again. Her father had called 2 weeks ago and asked her to come home. Her mother had been diagnosed with cancer, and he'd asked Jenna to come take care of her full-time. She couldn't say no. Her mama meant the world to her, and she would do anything for her. Plus, Jenna had learned that living in a big city was not her thing. The only reason she'd stayed this long was because of Talia. Her father had unknowingly provided her with the perfect excuse to leave. Jenna had spent the last few weeks packing. Talia had also decided to move out and into her Pax apartment building, and she already moved quite a bit of her stuff out, leaving the apartment mostly empty. Jenna's brothers would arrive tomorrow to take her home, and she couldn't wait. She'd only seen her family once since she'd been in New York, and she really missed them all. Jenna glanced over at Talia, who looked up and smiled before reaching over and gently squeezing her hand again. Almost there. The taxi pulled up in front of a dark building that resembled an old warehouse. Jenna slipped out of the car behind Talia, eyeing the building suspiciously. "Are we in the right place?" she asked, glancing around. There was no club visible, only the building, which looked uninhabited and creepy. "I've been here before," Talia reminded her as she confidently walked to the front of the building. The walkway sloped down to a discreet door, which she opened and gestured for Jenna to step in. They proceeded down a dimly lit hallway that smelled of liquor and body odour, before rounding a corner. Standing at the end in front of another door was a big, burly man in a suit. Definitely a wolf, Jenna thought, as the girls came to a stop in front of him. Talia flashed him a brilliant smile. "Who's she?" he asked gruffly, motioning towards Jenna. Jenna held her breath, suddenly realizing that this could be a really bad idea. Talia had told her how the werewolf community was so different from human society, how they were more violent and lived by their own set of laws. If he suspected that Jenna knew things she shouldn't, he could easily kill both of them. Jenna forced herself to remain calm as the thoughts continued to swirl wildly through her head. "Don't be suspicious. She's with me," Talia said, flashing him another smile. To Jenna's relief, the man simply nodded, stepped to the side, and opened the door. She was suddenly hit with the deep bass of the music. The building must be soundproof, she realized, looking around. The smell of alcohol and sweating bodies was heavy in the air. For wolves with sensitive senses, the strong smells must be overwhelming. At least the music wasn't overly loud. She followed Talia inside. A long bar stretched across the left wall, glowing under the low lights, and 5 bartenders and mixologists were at work behind it, serving up amazing-looking drinks. The dance floor stretched over the centre of the room, lights blazing in different directions, almost making her dizzy. The floor itself caught her attention. It was bright, giving the club some light, and the lights embedded inside changed with the beat of the music. A DJ was in a booth over on the wall across from the entrance, working his magic. Tables were lined up against the far-right wall with stools. A glowing balcony surrounded the entire place, seats and tables barely visible on the second floor in the dim lighting. The crowd was large and crushing as some of the most beautiful people Jenna had ever seen danced with each other. Talia grabbed Jenna's hand and pulled her over to the bar. She followed, her eyes still taking in the room, as Talia placed an order. She pushed a strawberry margarita into Jenna's hand, then downed a shot herself. Jenna wondered if it was the bourbon Talia had warned her about. She knew Talia didn't drink that much. She'd told Jenna her metabolism was too high, and she burned the alcohol off before it even gave her a buzz. But she had also told Jenna about the bourbon made by werewolves for werewolves. A pack in Kentucky brewed the stuff, and it was served at any and all werewolf establishments. "Let's dance," Talia shouted in Jenna's ear, and she nodded, following her friend out to the dance floor, her barely touched drink still clutched tightly in her hand. Jenna began moving to the beat, letting the music and the lights from the floor guide her. No one bothered her at first, but then she suddenly felt a pair of large hands grip her hips tightly. She turned around and was greeted by a handsome man with dark hair and eyes. Jenna began moving to the beat, letting the music and the lights from the floor guide her. No one bothered her at first, but then she suddenly felt a pair of large hands grip her hips tightly. She turned around and was greeted by a handsome man with dark hair and eyes. Wolf, she thought, giving him a smile, and he brushed her bonnet waves back from her neck. They danced for a few songs before he attempted to move his hands down past her lower back. She stiffened and gave him a glare, ready to yell for Talia, but he smirked at her before moving his hands back up to her waist, and she relaxed. After the song finished, he leaned in close, his nose brushing the curve of her neck. "I'll be right back." "Don't move," he gave her a smile, moving a thumb across her lip before walking away. Jenna watched him disappear into the bathroom, then rubbed the feel of his touch off of her lip, feeling disgusted. She looked around the club and spotted the stairs to the upper balcony in the far corner. She headed over to them as quickly as she could in the stilettos and hurried up the steps. The last thing she planned to do was wait around for Mr. Hansy. He could find someone else to grope. When Jenna reached the top of the steps, she looked around in awe. The railing around the entire balcony glowed, and so did the bar off to her left. 2 mixologists were working behind it, and servers were moving in and out of private rooms along the back walls, providing bottle service to each section. She walked over to the bar and ordered another margarita, before heading further along the balcony and away from the stairs. Walls separated each private room, though they were open in the front. Curtains were tied back and could be pulled to shield the occupants. The open booths displayed tables, chairs, and couches. Jenna played her favourite game of people watching as she strolled along, sipping her drink. Guests of all varying dress were inside the rooms, some partying, some conducting business, and one where several couples were busy making out and groping each other. Mr. Hansy would be at home here. Jenna smirked to herself. A couple in the back caught her attention. The woman had on a short skirt and was seated on the man's lap, facing him, their lips locked together. From her movements, Jenna guessed that much more than kissing was going on. She blushed and kept on moving. Most of the railing that overlooked the lower level had occupied seating. But about halfway around, Jenna finally came to an open area that looked out over the club. She stepped over to the edge to look down and rested her elbows on the railing, her eyes scanning the crowd below her. She spotted Talia after a few moments, dancing for all she was worth. Jenna shook my head with a smile. At least Talia was enjoying herself. A movement near the front entrance caught her eye, and she watched a blond man enter the club. Those closest to him stopped and nodded their heads towards him. She watched with interest as he moved to the bar, everyone he passed acknowledging his presence. 2 other men followed close behind him like bodyguards. He had to be someone important, and Jenna's mind raced back over the information Talia had shared about pack hierarchy. She doubted he was the pack leader, the alpha. As Talia had said, the man was older, in his late 40s, while this man looked to be in his mid-20s. Perhaps the second in command the better. Talia had told her a new beta had stepped up about a year ago, and how good-looking he was. She watched him step away from the bar with a drink and turned back to the crowd. Jenna suddenly felt eyes on her and glanced around the room again before her gaze finally landed on another man near the door. Her world felt as though it tipped sideways for a moment as their eyes met. Everything and everyone in the club faded away in that moment. He was easily the most beautiful man she had ever seen, and she had his full attention. His hair was dark, and he was very tall, his muscles filling out his black T-shirt. She felt a shiver run down her spine as he stared up at her, her body heating under his hot gaze. "Hey, baby, wanna dance?" a slurred voice said near her ear, causing Jenna to jump as she was suddenly brought back to earth, her connection with the gorgeous man gone. Disappointment and anger flooded through her at the interruption as she felt a hand squeeze her waist. She spun around and almost into a large man who was much too close. His breath reeked of alcohol, and she gagged as he leaned in towards her, trying to sniff her neck. He was good-looking and heavily muscled like most of the men in the club. If it wasn't for the way he was leering at her, she might have been interested in conversation, or maybe even a dance. Jenna felt a small tremor of fear run through her, and the man suddenly smirked. "He smells my fear," she realized quickly. Talia had reminded Jenna many times that werewolves were like predators. They could sense your emotions, your uneasiness, your fear. She swallowed hard, a million thoughts running through her head as she contemplated yelling for Talia. Would she even hear me up here? How good was her hearing, really? Why had I even allowed Talia to convince me to come tonight? I need to get myself out of this situation. Jenna forced herself to calm down and pasted a fake smile on her face. "No, thank you. I'm waiting for my boyfriend. He's supposed to be meeting me here after work." She thought she had lied pretty convincingly. The man's eyes narrowed at her, and he swayed a bit. "Yeah, right. You're just trying to get rid of me," he slurred, his gaze raking over her body. She suddenly wished that she had persisted in not wearing Talia's green dress. She felt naked under his penetrating gaze. Jenna tried to push past him, but he was like a brick wall and didn't budge. Stupid, oversized werewolves. She sidestepped to her right, so that she was no longer trapped between him and the railing at least. "Hey, where are you going?" He turned as well, following her movements. Suddenly, an arm went around her waist, accompanied by a tingling sensation. She was pulled back against a rock-hard chest, and her new captor's other arm went around her waist, holding her tight. "Hey, baby, sorry I'm late. Work just wouldn't end," a soft, masculine voice said close to her ear, sending shivers down her spine as a pair of arms wrapped around her from behind. The chest she was pulled back against was rock-hard, the arms pulling her close, well-muscled, and the tingles. They manifested everywhere he touched her, pleasantly arousing her. "Wait, what?" Jenna pulled her mind out of the gutter, quickly realizing that somehow whoever had their arms wrapped around her had overheard her lying, and she needed to play along. She placed her hands over his and smiled as the tingling intensified. "I thought you'd never get here." The drunk man stared at them both for a long moment, his gaze moving from Jenna to the man who held her in his arms. Her new boyfriend buried his face in her neck, kissing her gently. Desire shot through Jenna hard and fast, and she almost moaned. The tingles sharply intensified from the spot his lips touched, and all she wanted to do was turn around, kiss him, and find out how deeply those tingles could affect her. "I have to be losing my mind," she thought. "Get it together, Jenna. You're turned on by a man whose face you haven't even seen." Finally, the drunk seemed to get the hint, and turned to walk away. Her boyfriend kept his arms around her as they watched him go. He stopped and looked back at the couple before finally disappearing. Once he was gone, Jenna relaxed for a second, before tensing up again. She hoped she hadn't jumped straight from the frying pan into the fire. She turned around to thank her boyfriend, and was shocked to see the man she'd locked gazes with on the first level a bit ago. Her world tilted again as she stared into his beautiful blue eyes. His hands still lingered on her waist while they stared at each other. He was even more beautiful up close. His hair was dark and a bit wavy, longer on top and very short on the side. His face had hard planes and was covered with just a bit of stubble. Her eyes travelled down to his full lips, and Jenna sucked in a small breath, remembering the feel of them on her neck. Desire shot through her again. "Thank you," she said softly, unable to look away from his mesmerizing gaze. He smiled at her, his face lighting up before he reached up and gently cupped her cheek. Feelings of comfort and security ran through her, and Jenna stared back at him, entranced. She was safe with him. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did. He leaned in closer, and for a moment Jenna hoped he might kiss her again, but instead his lips brushed her ear. "You're welcome. Would you like another drink?" She flashed a smile at him, feeling a bit disappointed, but nodded. His hand travelled down her arm, leaving tingles in its wake, and he took her small hand in his large one. He led her back to the walkway, never letting her go. The tingles from his touch were magic, and Jenna could barely take her eyes off of him. He, too, kept glancing at her, a smile plastered on his sinfully handsome face. He stopped at the bar and ordered drinks. Jenna took the moment to spend some more time admiring him, her new favourite pastime. He wore a dark T-shirt, jeans and black dress shoes. Simple, but she could tell his clothes were expensive. His brown hair was styled to perfection, and he had just the right amount of stubble on his jaw. She imagined him rubbing that jaw across the inside of her thigh, and desire surged through her again. He suddenly glanced back at her, and Jenna blushed, shocked at where her traitorous thoughts had gone, and wondered if he could read them. Was that a werewolf trait? It better not be. Jenna knew Talia said that werewolves could communicate telepathically. Oh boy, she hoped he hadn't read her mind. She could feel herself turning into a tomato, but then again Talia had never said anything about being able to read her mind, unless she had just conveniently omitted that small bit of information. She made a mental note to ask Talia later. The bartender sat 2 shot glasses and a margarita in front of her mysterious date. He handed her a $100 bill before picking up the margarita and turning back to Jenna. She smiled as she took it from him, mouthing a thank you, and he returned her smile before picking up the 2 shot glasses and downing them in quick succession. He placed the empty glasses back on the bar. She was relieved he hadn't offered either of the shots to her. He had to be aware she was human, and she was about 90. 5% sure he was a wolf. It made her relax a bit more that he wasn't trying to take advantage of her. He took her hand again, and they began to walk back the way they had come, Jenna sipping her margarita and completely aware of the pleasurable tingles travelling up her arm from his touch. She'd never touched a male werewolf before. Were the tingles a thing with the opposite sex? She really had a lot of questions to ask her roommate later. Too bad she couldn't mind-link Talia now. He finally stopped at a booth with a closed curtain and pushed it aside, glancing inside, before pulling her in behind him. The booth was empty. Jenna followed him in, suddenly feeling a bit apprehensive. She was all but alone with him. He let the curtain fall back into place, drowning out some of the music and noise, then turned towards her and brought her hand up to his lips. She gasped softly as the tingles intensified. He lowered her hand and stepped closer. "What's your name?" He had a slight accent, she noticed, wondering where he was from. He almost sounded British, and she found it incredibly sexy. She swallowed and licked her lips, watching his gaze briefly drop to her mouth. "Jenna." "And yours?" He flashed her a brilliant smile. The man was dazzlingly beautiful. "Daniel." He took a step closer. "Jenna, may I kiss you?" His politeness caught her off guard, but she returned his smile. Yes, please." "I was disappointed you didn't earlier," she said, stepping closer and placing her drink on a nearby table. He smirked and placed his arms around her, pulling her up against his chest. Jenna rested her hands on it, feeling his muscles quiver slightly at her touch. The tingles danced between them again, causing her to shiver with delight as she looked into his gorgeous blue eyes. His lips came down on hers, and a rush of pleasure ran through her as he kissed her gently. His tongue traced her lips, and she opened her mouth to him, allowing him to deepen the kiss. His hand moved up her bare back, pulling her even closer to him. Jenna's head was spinning. She'd been kissed before, but never like this. Her body was responding to him as though he was touching her all over, even though he just had a hand on her back and one on her waist. She wanted to wrap her legs around him and rub herself all over him. She moaned into his mouth. "Her body on fire! Sir! Sir!" Daniel suddenly ended the kiss, and Jenna sighed in disappointment. Kissing him had been unlike anything she'd even experienced before. It had just been one kiss, but the intensity could have lit the place on fire. Her entire body was exceedingly aware of him, and the fact that his gorgeous blue eyes had never left her own. She stared back at him for a moment, biting her lip. Why was she so drawn to him? Jenna finally glanced past him to see who had so rudely interrupted the most amazing kiss of her life. A server had poked her head inside the curtain and was watching them warily. Jenna looked back at Daniel. His eyes were now glowing as he met her gaze. Yup, definitely a werewolf. And his wolf was looking at her. She shivered in response under his heated gaze. "Oh, Wolf, what's your name?" "Yes," Daniel finally responded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sir, you can't be in here," the server said. "This booth is reserved." Daniel reached up and gently cupped her cheek before leaning in to give her another light kiss on the forehead, before turning to the server. She stared at him for a moment, her eyes growing wide, before she frowned and bowed her head. "I'm sorry to bother you." She stepped back out of the curtain. Jenna watched her leave in surprise. What an odd reaction. She'd assumed that the blonde man she'd seen downstairs was the beta, but perhaps it was her Daniel. She scoffed inwardly, as if he'd ever be hers. She felt her heart drop. Daniel turned his full attention back to her and took a deep breath, his nostril flaring before he smiled. His eyes were no longer glowing and looked almost black now. "Should we go?" Jenna asked, not really wanting to, though the server had ruined their moment together. He pulled her back into his arms and buried his face in her neck. "Not yet," he whispered, trailing hot little kisses up her neck. She sighed as his lips found hers again, and she responded back, eagerly wrapping her arms around him and pulling him closer. She felt like she couldn't get enough of him, like he was a drug and she was newly addicted. He groaned, and his hands suddenly grabbed her bottom, and he lifted her up. Jenna immediately wrapped her legs around his waist, giving in to her earlier temptation to rub herself against him. He buried his face in her neck, and she moaned in his ear, the fire between them back but burning even more brightly. "Jenna!" He groaned and set her down on a table. He stepped back from her, then turned away. Jenna wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling empty and cold without his touch, though her eyes never left him. He stood a moment with his back to her, before turning back to her. "I have to stop before I take you right here in this club," he muttered. She barely heard him, and wondered if he had even meant for her to. At least our thoughts are in line with each other. Jenna blushed, catching his eye. Daniel walked back over to her and smiled as he ran his hands up her thighs, his fingers brushing under her skirt. "What are you thinking?" he asked, leaning close to her ear. "How much I want you to," she blushed again, and he laughed softly. The sound of his laugh sent a shiver down her spine, and she placed her hands on his back, feeling his muscles ripple beneath his shirt as she pulled him closer, revelling in the tingles that continued to pleasantly assault her body everywhere they touched. "Not here, Jenna. You deserve a bed for me to worship your body on." His lips brushed her ear before travelling down her neck, and she sighed. She had it bad for him. He kissed her again gently, but didn't linger this time, which was highly disappointing. "Let's go grab some drinks and then go dance." Jenna took a deep breath and nodded. "We can't continue this in the middle of a club, Jenna." It was still disappointing, though. She wanted to explore him more. His words sounded almost like a promise. "Okay." Daniel lifted her off the table, holding her close for a moment. Her legs had turned to jelly. She stepped away from him, working to regain her composure, then picked up her margarita and took a long sip. She looked back at Daniel. He was leaning casually against the wall, watching her. He seemed calm again, though for a few moments there, he seemed almost as dazed as she felt. Jenna took a step towards him. "I'm ready." He nodded and took her hand. They left the private booth and headed back to the bar. Daniel bought her another margarita and another 2 shots for himself, quickly downing them like he had the first 2. Then he grabbed her hand and led her down to the dance floor. The couple danced for the next few hours, enjoying every moment. Occasionally, men would try to dance with her, but one look from Daniel had them turning away. Women also occasionally tried to flirt with him, causing a pang of jealousy to hit Jenna, but Daniel ignored them. Jenna knew she shouldn't feel jealous. Daniel wasn't hers. She knew nothing about him, and there was no commitment between them. The fact he was a werewolf and she was a human that wasn't supposed to know anything about the supernatural world would only make things more complicated. All she could do was relish every second in his arms and not allow herself to think what would happen after tonight. She never wanted the night to end. They really hadn't spoken much, as the music made it difficult for her to hear anything, but that hadn't mattered. The tingles still danced between them wherever they touched, and he kept her close. Jenna was completely mesmerized by him. Closing time came much too soon, and the club began to empty out. Jenna suddenly felt a hand touch her back, and turned to see Talia standing there, sizing up Daniel. Her gaze darted back to Jenna. "Come to the bathroom with me." It was more of a command than a request, and she felt Daniel stiffen. She glanced at him, but he was looking at Talia with the same intense gaze he'd given the server. Jenna looked back at Talia. "I'll bring her right back," she said, at first meeting his gaze before suddenly dropping her eyes. Jenna leaned into Daniel. "I'll be right back," she whispered near his ear. His gaze softened as he looked at her, and he nodded. "I'll be waiting," he said, his lips brushing her ear. Jenna turned back to Talia and followed her to the bathroom. The moment the door closed, Talia was on her. "You've been dancing with him all night. Who is he?" she yelled. "He's not in your pack," Jenna answered Talia's question with one of my own. Talia shook her head. "I don't know who he is. It's weird he really has no aura at all, but the way he looked at me when I asked you to go to the bathroom. I bet he's an alpha," she shrugged. "But I've never seen him before. I just know his name is Daniel," Jenna said distractedly. "If he was an alpha of another pack, then he definitely wasn't from around here." Talia had told her that there were no other packs in New York. "He's really sweet," she murmured, looking at herself in the mirror. Her makeup was still pretty well in place, and she adjusted the dress. "Somehow, I don't think he'd appreciate you calling him sweet. He arrived with the beta of my pack." Talia checked her own makeup in the mirror before turning back to Jenna, the one you were dancing with. At some point during the night, she'd noticed Talia danced with the blonde man who had entered the club right before Daniel. Talia smiled. "Yep, and he's wanting us to leave with him. Apparently they have a hotel somewhere, and Daniel is coming too," Jenna questioned curiously. Maybe the night didn't have to end so soon. "I think so," Talia said. "You realize what will probably happen, right, Sex?" Jenna nodded, remembering how she'd wanted him to take her up in the private booth a few hours ago, and his response. "Not here, Jenna. You deserve a bed for me to worship your body on." Desire coursed through her once again. Talia looked at her sharply before looking back at the mirror. She pushed her blonde hair back and sighed. "Not sure I want to sleep with the beta, but oh, what the hell," she muttered. "You definitely want your date. Let's get you back to him before he sends out a search party." She pushed Jenna out of the bathroom. Jenna glanced around when they emerged from the bathroom. The club was almost empty. She saw the beta across the dance floor speaking to the men he had arrived with. Both of them had beautiful women clinging to them, probably wolves, Jenna thought. Talia headed across the floor to the beta. Daniel was standing near them, his arms crossed over his muscled chest as he waited for her. The moment he spotted Jenna, he headed her way. "We're all going to a hotel," he said when he approached her. his eyes scanning over her in a way that almost made her blush again. "Would you like to come and continue what we started earlier?" "Of course," he smiled back, taking her hand again and lifting it to his lips. "Okay, let's go." Outside of the club, a black stretch limo was sitting in front of the building, the smartly dressed chauffeur standing by the open door. The beta led Talia over to the limo and helped her in before climbing in himself. Jenna climbed in behind him and looked around the luxurious car. She'd never been inside a limo before. It was spacious with a seat in the back and another along either side. Talia and her date had moved near the front. Daniel crawled in behind her. "Come on," he said softly before seating himself close to Talia. Jenna followed him and sat down next to him. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her against him. She glanced at Talia, who was eyeing her with interest. The other two couples crawled in as well, and the door was closed. One of them promptly began to make out, and the man pulled the woman onto his lap, his hands travelling under her skirt. Jenna looked away, wondering if she was the only human in the car. Talia had told her that werewolves were very sexual creatures, and no one seemed bothered by the little show happening in the back of the car. Daniel chatted with the beta, and Jenna tuned him out, letting her thoughts wander. She hadn't had a boyfriend since she'd been in New York City. She'd been on a few dates, but none of them had been promising. She'd even made out with a few, but stopped before it progressed any further. On her senior prom night, her date had tried to have sex with her, but she'd shut him down. He'd been furious and broken up with her that night. She'd been upset at the time, but after she'd had time to get over it, she was glad she'd refused. He wasn't worth it. None of those men or boys, she thought ruefully, had made her feel the way Daniel did. He'd been the perfect gentleman all night, which attracted her to him even more. She wasn't sure what the rest of the night would bring, but if Daniel wanted her V card, she'd happily give it to him. Her phone binged, rousing her from her thoughts, and she glanced at it, then at Talia, who was holding her own phone and smirking at Jenna. "If you sleep with him, he'll ruin you for all other men," the message read. Jenna rolled her eyes at her friend and put her phone away. Talia was probably telling her the truth. She'd never felt tingles with anyone else like she did with him, or felt such an intense connection. She could only guess that it was a werewolf thing, and yes, Daniel would probably ruin her for human men if he hadn't already. The limo finally came to a stop, which was good because the couple in the back were practically having sex, and Jenna really wanted out. She would never be comfortable doing such a thing in front of others. They all piled out of the limo, and Daniel again took Jenna's hand, leading her into the hotel. She glanced around the lobby, her mouth dropping open. The hotel was one of the nicest in New York City. The lobby was huge and very modern. Large windows covered most of the walls, and she imagined during the day the place was filled with sunlight. They continued quickly through the lobby and got into the biggest elevator Jenna had ever seen. The doors closed, and Daniel pulled her back against him, wrapping his arms around her. She leaned back against his rock-hard chest, enjoying the tingles and warmth from him as his lips pressed against her cheek. The elevator rushed to the top, then opened up to a living area, tastefully decorated with white leather couches and chairs. A modern kitchen with dark cabinets was visible off to the right. Most of the walls were glass, letting in spectacular views of the city. The penthouse suite, Jenna realized, looking around. "Way to impress a girl, Daniel." The couples all scattered around the room, and the beta went to the kitchen, opening a refrigerator and pulling out a bottle of liquor. Daniel led Jenna over to a closed door off the living room and opened it. He walked in, pulling her with him, then shut the door, closing out the laughter and chatter from the living room. She glanced around curiously. It was a large bedroom, dominated by a king-sized bed and more dark modern furniture. Daniel walked across the room to a set of French doors and opened them up. "I want to show you something, Jenna." She followed him across the room and out the doors. A private patio stretched in front of them, but what caught her attention was the view. Jenna walked over to the railing. New York City stretched out in front of me for as far as she could see. "Oh, this is amazing," she smiled back at Daniel. He smiled and walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her. She leaned back against him. They fit so perfectly together, and Jenna felt like she was home. They stood there for a while, gazing out over the city, just enjoying being in each other's company. "You love the city?" Daniel asked, stepping away from her and closer to the edge. "Yes and no. It's beautiful, but I don't think I'd want to stay here forever." "It's just not for me," Jenna said with a shiver. It'd been so warm, and it wasn't warm at all up this high. Daniel immediately turned to her with concern. "Come here," he said, opening his arms. "Let's get back inside and I'll warm you up." He scooped her up and headed back into the room before setting her down and closing the door behind them. Then he turned around and pulled her back into his arms. Jenna lifted her head up to him and watched his eyes glow blue for a moment before he claimed her lips in a toe-curling kiss. "Jenna," he whispered, "let me claim you as mine." She reached up and pulled the halter loose on her dress, her gaze meeting his. "I'm all yours, Daniel," she whispered as she dropped the top. A few hours later, someone was shaking Jenna awake. She opened her groggy, gritty eyes. Talia was leaning over her, motioning for her to get up. Jenna frowned and shook her head no. Was she insane? It was barely even light out. Talia frowned back and made the same gesture more dramatically. Jenna sighed and slipped out of the warm bed, glancing back at Daniel. This was not a good idea. Talia's gaze moved down Jenna's naked body, and she raised her eyebrows. "Clothes!" she mouthed to Jenna, pointing to her own top. Jenna shrugged. In her half-asleep state, she had no idea where her clothes were. All she wanted to do was crawl back in Daniel's warm bed and sleep for a few more hours. Then maybe a repeat of last night, followed by a hot shower together, breakfast. She started to sit back down on the bed, but Talia grabbed her arm, stopping her. Talia gritted her teeth and sighed silently. She glanced around the room, then headed towards an open suitcase, grabbing a sweatshirt and boxers. She tossed the clothes at Jenna, then disappeared into the bathroom. Jenna frowned at Daniel's clothes. She was still so incredibly tired and out of it. She knew she hadn't slept nearly long enough. She could still feel the effects of the alcohol she'd consumed. Talia reappeared a few seconds later with a pair of hotel slippers in her hand. She glared at a still naked Jenna. "Get dressed," she mouthed in exasperation, then tapped her wrist in annoyance. Jenna rolled her eyes and began to pull the clothes on. Talia grabbed her hand the moment she was dressed and pulled her quickly out of the room. The rest of the suite was quiet, and the girls slipped into the elevator. Talia dropped the slippers in front of Jenna, who slipped her feet into them. "Why the rush?" she mumbled with a yawn. "I wasn't ready to leave yet," Talia groaned. "I refused to sleep with the better. It was just getting awkward." She sighed, watching the numbers above the door as they descended back to the lobby. Jenna leaned back against the elevator wall and closed her eyes tiredly. The elevator door opened, and Talia grabbed her hand, pulling her out the door. She dragged Jenna across the lobby and out into the chilly early morning air. It was just starting to get light outside, and the cold woke Jenna up a bit more. Talia hailed a cab. When one pulled up, she pushed Jenna inside, then crawled in after her, slamming the door behind herself. She gave the driver their address, and they began the trip home. Jenna leaned her head back against the seat, moments from the previous night floating through her mind. She sighed as she remembered Daniel's hands on her body, his lips on her neck. The next thing she knew, Talia was shaking her awake. "Come on, we're home." Jenna crawled out of the car after Talia and followed her into their building. They got in the elevator, and Talia pushed the button for their floor. "I'm already sore," Jenna muttered, wincing as she leaned against the wall. Talia glanced at her in surprise. "When was the last time you had sex?" Jenna just gave her friend a small smile. Talia's mouth dropped open. "You gave your V-card to a werewolf. You're ruined for all other men now. You know that, right?" Jenna just smiled again. She didn't care if Daniel had ruined her. She would cherish her night with him for the rest of her life. Why had she let Talia drag her out? At the moment, though, she was too tired and still a little too buzzed to care. She'd confront her about it later. The elevator doors opened, and Jenna stepped off and headed quickly down the hall, Talia hot on her heels. All she wanted to do right now was crawl back in bed and dream about Daniel. She unlocked the door, and they both entered the apartment. "What time are your brothers going to be here?" Talia asked, tossing her bag down before heading for the bathroom. Oh, yes. She'd forgotten about them. "Around 2. I'm going to bed." Jenna stifled a yawn as she followed Talia down the hall. "I might not be here when you get up. I'm going to sleep a few hours, then take a load of stuff to the Pack apartment." Talia looked at herself in the mirror before grabbing a cloth to wash off her face. "Okay. Good night, Talia." "Night, Jenna." Jenna closed her bedroom door. She slipped off Daniel's clothes, then crawled into bed. She was back asleep within minutes. The ringing phone woke Jenna up several hours later. She sat up, groaned, and glanced at the clock. It was 2 p.m. She rubbed at her face and frowned. Something was happening at 2 p.m., though she couldn't remember what. The incessant ringing of her phone finally penetrated her sleep-fogged brain, and Jenna grabbed it, glancing at the screen. "Talia, her brother! Hello," she asked sleepily. "Jenna, are you still in bed? Are you still in bed?" The voice on the other end practically shouted at her. Oh, yes. They were coming to get her today. Knew who, she lied. "Really? I "We're here. Open up your door and let us in," Tyler demanded. "Okay, give me just a sec." Jenna jumped out of bed and grabbed the boxes and sweatshirt she'd stolen from Daniel that morning. She slowed down for a moment as his scent enveloped her, thoughts of his lips on her flooding her mind. She swallowed as pain filled her heart. Why had she left with Talia that morning? She should have stayed, and things would have probably been awkward. Maybe it was for the best that she had left. She threw his clothes on, then ran into the living room to buzz her brothers into the building. While she waited for them to come up, she looked around for Talia. Her bedroom was empty, and Jenna found a note on the fridge. Talia had taken a load to her new apartment and wouldn't be back until later. A loud rap at her door had Jenna scurrying over to it. She glanced through the peephole and then threw the door open. Tyler scooped her up in his arms, hugging her tightly. "Wow, Jenna, it's been way too long." "I know," she smiled as he set her down. She turned to her youngest brother, Michael, and hugged him tightly. "Hey, Sis, is your hot roommate home?" he asked, returning her hug. She took a load to her new apartment on the other side of town. Jenna said with a smile. Michael had developed a crush for Talia ever since he'd laid eyes on her. "Damn," he muttered in disappointment. "You did just wake up," Tyler said, looking her over. "Since when are you a fan of the Steelers?" Jenna looked down at the sweatshirt she was wearing and saw the logo emblazoned across her chest. Well, I guess it's appropriate since you're moving to Pennsylvania," Tyler laughed. "I thought we were moving to Virginia." Jenna looked at him in surprise. Her parents had been living in Virginia for the past few years, since her father worked in Washington. "No, they just bought a house in Pennsylvania," Michael said, glancing around at the half-empty apartment. Jenna shrugged. Since her father was in the Marines, moving was a way of life. She'd lived all over. "What was one more place? I need to take a quick shower," Tyler nodded. "Show us what needs to be taken down, and Michael and I will begin to load the truck." Jenna took them to her room and showed them the boxes she already had stacked up, ready to go. She wasn't taking any furniture with her. There was no point, as she wouldn't need it at her parents' house, and nothing in her apartment meant that much to her. Talia would be able to put it all to good use in her new apartment, and would have a few of the guys from her pack move it for her soon. Jenna gave her brothers her keys to get back inside her apartment, then grabbed the clothes she'd left out to wear for the day. She stepped into the bathroom and slipped Daniel's clothes off. She wanted to take his memory with her. One memory of her night of bliss with him. Jenna glanced in the mirror. A small bruise at the base of her neck caught her attention, and she leaned closer. She could see a bite there. "You're mine, Jenna." His words came back to her right before he bit her during the most intimate part of their night together. "I'm going to mark you." What did that mean? He'd said it right before he'd sunk his teeth into her neck. His canines, she realized. Was that a werewolf thing? She couldn't recall Talia ever mentioning such a thing. Or had she? Jenna grabbed her phone and texted Talia. "What does it mean when you get marked?" She sat the phone back down and looked at the bite in the mirror again. She remembered the unbelievable ecstasy that had hit her when he'd latched onto her neck. Desire ran through her, almost causing her to moan out loud. Daniel. Jenna felt the pang of loss grip her again and pushed it away before stepping into the shower. She bathed quickly, though if it wasn't for her brothers, she would have taken her time, reminiscing over every detail of her night. She stepped out and dried off, then applied a bit of makeup before pulling her hair up. She tossed on her clothes, then grabbed all of her things from the bathroom before heading back into her bedroom, surprised to find that her brothers had half of her stuff already loaded. Jenna tossed Daniel's clothes into a laundry bag and the rest of her things into a duffel, then began to help her brothers load the rest of her things. "This is the last box, Jenna," Tyler said a half hour later as he carried the box to the truck. Jenna was standing downstairs next to the truck, looking at her phone. She still hadn't heard back from Talia. She set the phone down on the back of the bed of the truck. Jenna turned towards her brother and took the box from him. She turned back towards the truck, knocking her phone off. "You need to lock up," Tyler asked her, as Michael came out the door holding her laundry bag. "Yeah, I want to take one more look around to make sure I haven't forgotten anything." Jenna grabbed her keys from her brother, then headed back up to the apartment she'd called home for the last 2 years. She took a quick look around and sighed. She'd miss it, and she was pissed at Talia for not returning home yet to say goodbye. Jenna pulled her apartment keys off of her keyring and left them on the table. Then she wrote a quick note for Talia, deciding she'd call her later. She took one last look around and sighed. So many memories. This was where she'd gotten her werewolf education. She sighed, then closed the door and headed downstairs. Time to begin a new chapter of her life. Tyler and Michael were leaning against the truck waiting for her. She flashed them a smile. "Let's go." Tyler walked around to the driver's side, and Jenna crawled into the middle of the bench-style seat. Michael slipped in next to her. 10 years ago, she would have never been happy sitting in the middle on such a long trip, but now she didn't mind one bit. She'd missed her brothers, missed their protectiveness, and the camaraderie she'd shared with them. They rode in silence for a while as Tyler concentrated on getting out of the city. Jenna watched her brother grip the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. Tyler had served for 4 years in the Navy as a corpsman, and Jenna knew he'd been deployed 3 times during his duty. He had decided after those 4 years that military life wasn't for him, and he'd been living at home ever since. Her brother, Jonah, had joined the Marines like her father. He'd served for 2 years now. He talked as if he wanted to make a career out of it, and Jenna wondered if he actually would. Michael, the youngest, had surprised everyone by deciding to go into law enforcement instead of the military. He was still in high school, though, but he was a senior and would graduate in a few months. All 3 of her brothers had brown hair and green eyes, like her. They were all 3 around 6 feet in height and obsessed with the gym. It had become a competition for the 3 of them, seeing who could outlift the other. Jenna's father was a career Marine. He'd been in before she was born, and he was now a general. Her father would die a Marine, she smirked. Her mother had always been a housewife, holding the fort down and raising her 4 children while her father had been deployed. Jenna wondered how Daniel would fit in with her family. She realized she knew so little about him. He had an accent, apparently like the Steelers, and was an incredible lover. But he was also a dominating werewolf, and she knew the men in her family were all alpha males. Would they get along or clash? Her brothers were constantly in competition with each other, trying to outdo the other. They didn't fight much now that they were older, but to say that her mother had her hands full with the 3 boys would be an understatement. Talia had said Daniel wasn't in her pack, so he must belong to some other pack. She had explained rogues, pack hierarchy, territories, and so on. Jenna had listened intently, taking mental notes, though she had never let on to Talia that she was doing so. She wished now that she had asked Talia more questions. Her friends seemed to think Daniel might be an alpha, which meant Daniel had his own pack somewhere out there, and given that he had an accent, he might not even be from America. Why hadn't she asked him any questions? She knew why. She hadn't wanted him to guess that she knew what he was. It would put both her and Talia in danger. Jenna sighed softly. The chances of her ever seeing him again were slim to none. The thought of that was enough to break her heart, and a sharp pang ran through her body, causing her to almost whimper out loud. "When did I fall in love with him?" "Dad's retiring." Michael's words snapped Jenna out of her heartache, and she stared at her brother in shock. "What?" "It's true," Tyler said. His grip on the steering wheel now relaxed as they sped down the highway. New York City was finally behind them. "When?" 2 months from now," Michael said. "That's why they bought the house in Pennsylvania." That made sense, though Jenna was having a hard time believing her dad was retiring. The core was in his soul, and she'd always thought they'd have to bury him while he was still active duty. It had to be something major for her father to even consider stepping away from what he loved so much. "Because of Mum," neither brother responded, giving Jenna the answer she needed. Family was the only thing her father loved more than the core, and her mother was the love of his life, his soulmate. "You'll like the house in Pennsylvania," Michael smiled at her, but Jenna noticed the sadness in his eyes. She'd seen the same sadness in Tyler's eyes, she realized eyes. She felt another pang in her heart, and was suddenly very glad she was going home. The chatter in the truck turned happy after that, as her brothers teased her affectionately. "So any boyfriends left behind in New York?" Tyler asked her with a smile. "Yes! Nope, I didn't have a lot of time for men," she said. Of course, they would bring that up. She really hadn't been serious about anyone ever, and her brothers enjoyed harassing her about it. "Did you ever go to any clubs?" Michael asked curiously, looking up from his phone. "As a matter of fact, I went to one last night." Jenna smiled, her thoughts returning to Daniel, and the moment their eyes met across the club. It had been such a magical moment. And then he'd come to her rescue, her knight in shining armor. "Did you hook up with anyone?" Tyler asked, his eyes still on the road. Jenna turned red as thoughts of Daniel's hands on her body invaded her mind. "You're mine, Jenna." "She did." "She hooked up," Michael shouted, watching his sister's face. Tyler glanced at her and laughed. "One night stand," she sighed, and both of her brothers started laughing hysterically. "You have to tell us, Jenna," Tyler urged. "I'm not going to kiss and tell." Jenna stared at her brother in mock horror. "At least tell us something," Michael begged, still laughing. Jenna groaned. "I met him at the club last night. We hooked up afterwards. At a hotel, by yourself, Tyler asked, a bit concerned. Did he bail on you after? Michael asked. No, I bailed on him, Jenna said, wondering if she would regret it for the rest of her life. What? Both of her brothers shouted at the same time. I wasn't alone. Talia was with me. We went to the club together and both hooked up with two guys that were friends. Talia knew her date, though, but she decided not to. Hook up, and we left, Jenna vaguely explained. Whoa, wow. I can't believe you did that, Michael laughed hysterically as he looked back down at his phone. Jenna glanced at Tyler and saw him scrutinizing her. He met her gaze briefly, then looked back at the road. It was a nice hotel, she told Michael. How nice! He looked back at her with interest. Michael loved New York City, or so he said. Jenna thought he just loved Talia and the fact that she was in the city. Kent House Suite, overlooking New York City, she smiled, remembering Daniel's arms around her, the city of New York at their feet. So you hooked up with a rich guy? Tyler asked curiously. Jenna frowned. I don't know. I'm not sure who paid for the hotel room. It was already rented out when we got there, and there were 8 of us total. She supposed the beater could have paid for it, but he would live in the city. Had they got it specifically for Daniel? Was he that important of a guest, or had it just been because they knew they would be bringing women back with them after a night of partying? Jenna hated to think that Daniel might hook up like that on a regular basis. You're mine, Jenna. Did he say that to all the women he hooked up with? Jealousy rushed through her heart, and she fisted her hands. The hotel had been one of the most expensive in New York, though. There were cheaper ones they could have brought dates to. She sighed, and saw Tyler glance at her again. We didn't really talk much. I don't even know his last name. Any regrets? Michael teased. She gave him a big smile. Yes, I never should have left. Nope. Can we stop for food? I missed breakfast. A few hours later, they pulled up in front of a huge, rambling 2-story grey house in front of a lake. Another house sat to the right of it, though there were trees between the two, giving it some privacy. A wooded area was to the left. Someone owns that property, though we have no idea who. But there are paths that we've hiked on a few times, Tyler said, seeing her gaze and pointing to the woods. So you're trespassing, Jenna teased him. He shrugged, and Jenna rolled her eyes. So like her brothers. Michael had already exited the truck, and Jenna started to follow him to the house, but Tyler grabbed her arm to stop her. Mom's had 3 chemo treatments already, Jenna, he said softly, gazing into her eyes. Okay. She slid across the seat and out of the truck. She stopped, looking around. The place was beautiful. She had never really developed a love for the city, and being out away from the big buildings, people and smog was refreshing. Not New York City, Michael said, stepping up beside her. No, it's so much better, Jenna smiled happily. She was already falling in love with the huge house. Her father stepped out the door and stood on the wrap-around porch, staring at her, his arms folded across his chest, his expression stoic. Jenna's eyes widened in surprise. Dad's here, she asked Michael. He's here every weekend, Michael answered quietly. Jenna walked across the yard, up the porch stairs and into her father's open arms. Daddy, she whispered. Jenna, she whispered. Jenna. I'm so glad you're home, he said, his voice gruff as he squeezed her tightly. She knew her father had never liked her living in New York. I'm home to stay, she pulled back. No more city, he asked, brushing her hair back from her face. No, I didn't like it as much as I thought I would. This place is amazing. Rocking chairs dotted the porch along with large potted plants. She could already visualize sitting out here with her family in the evenings. The General gave her one of his rare smiles. I hope you'll be happy here. Even when you're married, there will always be a place for you here. She smiled up at him. Where's Mom? A shadow crossed his still handsome face, and Jenna felt her stomach clench. She's sleeping right now. Jenna, I want you to go take a look at her now while she's sleeping so you're prepared when she's awake. He stared down at her, and she could see the sorrow in his eyes. She searched his face for a moment, then nodded. I'll show you where her room is, Michael said, walking past her. Jenna followed him inside the house and stopped, looking around. The home had an open floor plan with the living room on one side and a large kitchen on the other. An oversized island separated the two spaces. Big, overstuffed furniture was situated around the room, facing a large fireplace with a TV screen above the mantel. The kitchen was huge, with lots of white cabinets. A large table sat in the back, and she could already visualize family meals there. Too bad Jonah wasn't home, or Daniel wasn't here. Jenna glanced out the huge windows that covered most of the back of the house. The view looked out over the lake. Beyond a large backyard, a long dock stretched out over the water. "How big is that lake?" Jenna asked as she stepped over to the windows to look out. 700 acres, Michael smiled at her delight. "We're going to get a boat this summer," Jenna nodded, returning his smile. "That'll be fun." She turned and followed him down a small hallway and past a bathroom before coming to a closed door at the end. Michael opened it slowly and Jenna stepped in. The room was very large, with a bed on the far wall. The right side had a window looking out to the lake. In front of the window, 2 recliners and medical equipment. A small figure was huddled under the comforter on the bed, fast asleep. Jenna moved closer and was surprised to see a bald head barely sticking out. She walked around the bed and was shocked at what she saw, barely stifling her gasp. The woman in the bed looked nothing like her mother. Caroline Browning was one of the strongest women Jenna knew. While her father had served overseas on countless deployments, Caroline had been both mother and father to her 4 small children. She'd held it together, and Jenna had no idea how. This frail woman laying in the bed was not her mama. Jenna covered her mouth to hold back her cries as tears started flowing down her cheeks. She bolted from the room and out of the house, collapsing on the front porch steps as she began hyperventilating. Tyler sat down next to her and pushed her head down between her knees. "Breathe, Jenna!" he commanded. He sat down next to her on the step, gently rubbing her back. Jenna finally got her breathing under control, and she sat staring ahead as sobs racked her body. What had happened to her mother? She knew cancer and chemo were hard on you, but she'd never thought her mother would look this different. The thought of losing her made Jenna's heart break, and she suddenly found herself longing for the comfort of Daniel's arm. Tears streamed down her cheeks for her mother, and some, she realized, for the man she'd spent the night with. She wiped at her face, then turned to her brother. "Why didn't you warn me?" she accused, sorrow making her angry and wanting to lash out. "I did," he said with a frown. "I did," he said with a frown. "I told you she'd had 3 chemo treatments already." "That's not a warning, Tyler," she muttered. He shrugged. "Let's get your stuff moved in before Mom wakes up," he said, standing up and reaching a hand out to her. Jenna grabbed his arm. "Is she?" She couldn't bring herself to say it. Tyler looked back at his sister and wrapped his arm back around her. "Anything is possible, Jenna, but she's doing pretty well so far. Mom is one of the strongest people I know. She'll pull through." Earlier that day. "Wake up!" Daniel Remington's eyes snapped open, and he rolled over onto his back with a slight groan. He had drunk way too much last night. "It's about time. Been trying to wake you for the last several hours. Next time, don't drink so much. This building could have come down and you'd still be sleeping. Some king you are." Daniel threw his arm over his eyes to block out the light. "What time is it?" "Is Wolf." Rafe retorted with annoyance. To sleep the day away. Memories from the previous night flooded Daniel's brain, and he groaned again. "Jenna! After so many years of searching, he'd finally found his mate, his Luna, his queen. She's perfect," Rafe murmured happily as he pushed images of Jenna through Daniel's foggy mind. He'd been drunk. He'd been mostly drunk before he'd arrived at the club, and had sealed the deal with the few shots he'd consumed when he'd gotten there. Had he mated with her last night? He rolled over to her side of the bed and found it empty. "And this is why I've been trying to wake you," Rafe said sarcastically, frustration clear in his voice. Daniel got up off the bed and glanced in the bathroom. He opened up his bedroom door and took a quick trip around the penthouse suite. While her scent still lingered faintly, Jenna most definitely was not there. Daniel walked back into the bedroom. Her scent was the strongest in here, but it was fading fast. "You're wasting your time." "She's not here." Rafe rolled his eyes. "I've been trying to tell you this the whole time, but do you listen to me? No, oh." He spotted her dress near the door and picked it up. Her scent permeated the air, and he breathed it in. "But if her clothes were here, where was she? Where was she? Where did she go?" "She left with the she-wolf." "Early this morning. I tried waking you then," Rafe huffed, "so you could stop her or go after her. But it was like trying to wake the dead, and now she's long gone." Daniel walked back into the hotel room and placed the dress down on the bed. His eyes caught a small spot of blood on the sheets, and he frowned as Rafe pushed more memories to the surface. The way he had slowly entered her, trying not to hurt her. She'd seemed okay with it, but his mate had definitely been a virgin, and that pleased both of them to no end. "Told ya she was perfect," Rafe said smugly. He'd barely kept still at the club the night before. He'd been so excited to find her. Daniel walked over to his suitcase and grabbed some boxers and a T-shirt. His favourite hoodie was gone. He looked around the room again. "Mate wore it out of here," Rafe said happily. "Mate left with that other she. Wolf? Maybe we need to question the beta then. He seemed to know her pretty well," Daniel responded as he rubbed his neck. He dressed quickly and left the room, then pushed open the door to the room where Beta Chris was sleeping. "Chris," he said loudly as he walked in. The beta sat up and rubbed at his eyes. There were only a handful of people who could get away with waking him up. Daniel Remington was on that short list, and he didn't look happy. Chris cringed and bowed his head. "Alpha, the she-wolf you brought here last night? Where did she go?" Daniel asked him as he looked around the room. "She ain't hiding," Rafe rolled his eyes again. "She left early this morning with the human girl," Chris said, wondering why Daniel cared. "Why?" Daniel growled with annoyance. Chris sighed. "She decided she didn't want to sleep with me. Wolf left because this beta can't seal the deal," Rafe asked in disgust. "Looks that way." Daniel lifted his brows at the beta and crossed his arms. "Things were getting awkward, so she left," the beta muttered, rubbing his face. "This was embarrassing. What do you know about her?" Daniel asked him, watching him carefully. "Her name is Talia, and she's a member of my pack. Other than that, nothing," Chris shrugged. "I've never met her before, and the woman with her, my mate." "Oh, mate," Rafe corrected. Chris shrugged. "Talia didn't mention her at all. I need to find her," Daniel told him, glaring at him. Chris frowned. He almost asked why, but thought better of it. The last thing he needed was to make Daniel Remington angry. "Okay, I'll call Alpha Quinton and have him meet us at his office. He has a database with every member of the pack's info in it. We'll get Talia's number, call her and find out where the human is." "Jenna. Her name is Jenna," Daniel growled at Chris, some of his powerful aura seeping out. Chris swallowed hard, fighting the urge to submit even more to the wolf staring at him. "Jenna," he whispered, then cleared his throat. "We'll find her, Alpha." Daniel turned and marched out of the room. Chris breathed out as the Alpha left, feeling a little lighter once the powerful aura was gone, and grabbed his phone, dialing his Alpha. "Quinton, we have a situation." Daniel slammed the door of his room and leaned back against it. He, the man of infinite patience, was rapidly losing it. The need to find his mate and protect her was really agitating both him and Rafe. He headed towards the bathroom, striping his clothes off along the way. Hopefully, a shower would help clear his head. He didn't have a hangover, compliments of being a werewolf, but when he drank a lot, he tended to sleep very hard, and his head felt foggy the next morning. It was why Jenna had been able to easily slip out of his room, and why his own wolf wasn't able to wake him. Rafe grumbled with annoyance. Daniel climbed into the shower. The hot spray battered his body, and he closed his eyes, allowing the memories from the previous night to wash over him. Jenna's sweet disposition, her beautiful body, her sweet mouth, her soft moans, the way she had tasted. "You're mine, Jenna!" A sudden rush of excitement and happiness suddenly blindsided Daniel, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Rafe, what is going on? Where did that come from?" "Mate is very happy." Rafe gave him a happy grin, wagging his tail, pleased his mate was excited. "Wait." Had he marked her? Daniel scrubbed at his face, trying to remember. "I'm going to mark you." The ecstasy they had both felt when he'd sunk his canines into her neck. He had marked her, and since she was human, that had completed the mating process. Daniel groaned. What had he been thinking, marking a human? There had been no discussion, and she'd been so aroused and, well, he didn't think she'd been drunk. He hadn't wanted her to be drunk. But what had she thought about that? "She is mate," Rafe stated, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. The wolf was starting to grow more irritated with him. "Why would we not mark her?" "She belongs to us. She was their mate, yes, but still. He hadn't told her he was a werewolf. What if she didn't want to be with a werewolf? What if she couldn't accept him?" He leaned against the shower wall and closed his eyes. If Jenna rejected him, "We're still bound to her till one of us dies. No matter what." Rafe sat down dejectedly, as the full force of what they had done washed over the both of them. "But mate adores us." "I felt that too, but at the same time, some things you can't overcome, and a man who not only turns into a wolf, but is also king, and all that entails could top that list." Rafe's tail dropped, and the wolf huffed, laying down dejectedly. "Find her, Daniel." "I plan to, Rafe," Daniel replied, and hurried through his shower. He dressed quickly, then went to go find Chris.